Who doesn't love a good drama? Well, the company boardroom, for one. While organizations often find themselves in the news for both good and bad reasons, rarely do you hear about a company board, unless something has gone terribly wrong. Just ask Hockey Canada, which in 2022 saw its entire board resign following numerous alleged sexual assault scandals. Or take Rogers and its namesake family, which viciously and publicly fought over the replacement of the company's CEO in 2021. Even Disney, home to the happiest place on earth, was embroiled in a messy dispute as investors fought for a seat at the table earlier this year.
When the disagreements are more minor, they usually never bubble up to a point where general public like you and me know about them, because all the discussions are supposed to stay behind closed doors. It's only when it's something really major that we hear about it.
Ada Siamek Wahid has spent most of her academic career studying boardrooms. The associate professor of accounting wrote her PhD thesis on the makeup of board members and has since advised trading bodies like the NASDAQ on diversity reporting requirements. She's explored everything from how directors' past experience can influence companies' valuation to how demographic diversity, particularly gender, influences board decision-making. Unsurprisingly, who sits on the board can have a huge impact on how organizations move forward, particularly when a company is in flux, whether that's a crisis or a period of growth. As we move through a time of unprecedented technological change, potential economic upheaval, and as we continue to grapple with the legacy of the pandemic, we should be asking, do boards have the right talent at the table? And what will it take to build a better board? Welcome to the Executive Summary. I'm Megan Haynes, editor of the Rotman Insights Hub. Let's start with a simple question. What exactly does a corporate board do?
So board has two main roles. One role is to monitor the management, and the other one is to advise it on the key issues. Monitoring includes a review of financial reports, hiring of auditors, oversight of risk management process, hiring and firing of the CEO, determining the compensation structure of CEO, and setting governance policies, and even recruiting new board members. The advising role is more strategic in nature and involves helping the top executive team by reviewing or approving strategy, providing advice or expertise on strategic issues, and so on.
It's a relatively straightforward role. Boards hold companies, particularly their CEOs, to account and provide their expertise on big picture decision-making. Usually, a board will split off its duties into smaller committees, say a committee to determine the CEO compensation, or one that reviews an organization's ability to meet its governance requirements. Committee members will discuss and debate the issues and make decisions, which they then bring back to the whole board to approve or reject. Boards hold a lot of power over organizations, so what happens when things go wrong on the board itself? This is actually what prompted Ada to start studying these dynamics in the first place.
When I was in a PhD program, it was just after the Enron scandal broke out and around the time when financial crisis was unfolding in the US.
In 2001, it was discovered that through a variety of shady accounting practices, Enron had hid billions of dollars of its debt. The company ended up facing a $40 billion lawsuit, its accounting firm was dissolved, and a number of executives were charged with fraud. And its board was found to have failed in its duty to its shareholders, knowingly allowed the company to engage in high-risk accounting practices, and failed to properly monitor the activities of Enron executives.
And at that time, people were wondering how we got to the point that these corporations fail without anybody in the boardroom noticing along the way that something is wrong. So there was this collective question mark as to where the boards were when things were happening, when things were going down.
Ada started to look at board composition, who actually gets a seat at the vaunted table.
There was a lot of talk of the board environment being overridden by groupthink mentality and lack of critical questioning of executive decisions. And so I was naturally curious if that groupthink mentality had something to do with the fact that everyone in the boardroom looked the same.
It's likely not a surprise to learn that back in the early 2000s, the majority of board members, including those at Enron, were predominantly older white men.
So when you have the majority of any given board composed of men from the same ethnic background, around the same vintage, who socialize in the same circles, it's really no surprise that there's not much pushback in the boardroom.
The big issue comes down to what Ada calls groupthink, a phenomenon which happens when a group of individuals reach consensus without critical reasoning or evaluation of the consequences or alternatives. In effect, they all just kind of agree with each other without any real discussion. That's not to say consensus is bad. Smooth running boards might work well when everyone agrees and gets along. And too much disagreement can cause an otherwise cohesive board to break down. But when people are naturally inclined to agree with each other, it also means no one is asking the tough questions. Ada's early research showed that when a company added women to its board, fraud and financial reporting mistakes declined. It's not that women are inherently more honest. Even when more women were added to boards, fraud didn't miraculously disappear.
Increasing the number of female directors is associated with an incremental decrease in likelihood of fraud, but only to a point, and after which the benefits of this start to diminish. So this finding, along with other analyses that showed the difference in the likelihood of fraud is not attributable to the differences in effort or skill, to me that implies that this is likely driven by a change in board dynamics. And that's what really leads to us to observe this decreased likelihood between fraud and restatements and increased gender diversity.
What happened is a new variable was thrown into the mix to counter groupthink. Suddenly, not everyone looked like each other, so the conversation at the table changed.
The idea behind diversity is that it improves board effectiveness by increasing perspective diversity, which in turn counters that groupthink mentality and complacency, and hopefully leads to better deliberations and decision-making.
It's that diversity of perspective that's important to counter groupthink. One of Ada's papers showed, for example, that diversity of tenure, how long someone has sat on a board, can have a big impact on, say, hiring and firing decisions. Boards with a mixed makeup of newer and more seasoned directors tended to perform best when it comes to governance, thanks to that mix of fresh perspectives and those with in-depth organizational knowledge. But of course, diversity for many means gender, race, and sexuality. So let's dig into that a little bit. One 2003 study found that gender-diverse boards were better at disciplining their CEOs, while another study from that year found that they had higher stock valuation. More recently, a 2011 study found that they had improved governance records. Exchanges like the NASDAQ used these findings, as well as Ada's other work, to compel organizations to report on their board makeups. Today, the NASDAQ requires companies listed on the exchange to publicly disclose board-level diversity stats such as age, gender, race, disability status, and sexuality. By the mid-2020s, companies will have to defend why they have not met diversity targets on their boards. Opponents say this type of policy runs the risk of introducing tokenism, which Ada explains as
adding a member of underrepresented group to check the box, really, without real intention of improving board dynamics through enhanced or expanded conversations that come from having a unique perspective. Unfortunately, tokenism was very real in the early days of board diversification when a female director would be added to a board just for optics.
If an organization isn't committed to actually bringing new voices to the table, then yes, tokenism can be a big problem. But as Ada says,
the good thing about increased diversification is that it becomes more difficult to engage in tokenism as the number of underrepresented members on the board start to increase and composition of the group is more balanced. So it becomes more difficult to marginalize opinions of someone we disagree with if we have multiple people who have different opinions and we have to kind of listen to each other's opinions and engage in conversation.
Today, women hold 34% of Canadian board seats on the TSX index, up from 30% in 2020. In the US, they make up 32.3% of directors at S&P 500 companies. Racial and ethnic minorities hold 14% of those seats in Canada, nearly double the rate that it was in 2020. So representation is improving, though there are still stumbling blocks. Part of the issue, Ada points out, is that opponents to diversification often rely on the argument that there's no way to definitively prove that a diverse board will outperform a non-diverse one, since you can't create control groups to test that theory. But on the flip side, that also means you can't disprove the theory that diversification improves effectiveness.
Do we really need the ultimate proof that a relatively short-term shareholder value will improve if we diversify for us to be willing to go down this path? Is it really onus on the underrepresented individuals to prove that they're more valuable, not equally valuable, mind you, more valuable to the firm shareholders here and now for us to move in the direction of more balanced representation?
The needs of boards often follow the trends in the world. When Ada first started looking at director makeup, the top skills needed were financial in nature.
The emphasis was really on having directors with financial expertise because at that time we had all these financial and accounting frauds. And as financial crisis was unfolding just a couple of years later, the focus shifted towards having board members who had risk management expertise.
Today, we're looking at a big tech shift, which means directors need more tech know-how.
That's anywhere from general tech background to actually having a background in e-commerce, and even more so now cybersecurity. Because if we just look at number of cybersecurity incidents that companies are facing with, it's something that every director has on the forefront of their mind. What are the risks to the organization, and what are the risks to me? Reputational risk, if it comes out that we are hit by a cybersecurity breach, and then we have to deal with consequences of this.
So what's next? Well, ESG, or environmental social governance, is on everyone's lips.
Being able to contribute as to how boards and organizations can improve their ESG performance, but also understand how they can practically measure and relate those actions they're taking to the stakeholders. How can they convey their path? So board members with expertise in this area are really sought out at this point.
ESG investing, generally speaking, evaluates organizations for their social conscientiousness, whether that's looking at a company's environmental issues and green standards, or whether they fairly treat their employees and communities in which they operate. It's a contentious and complicated topic, with governments and organizations often pushing back, divesting investment from areas that are not ESG friendly, such as the fossil fuel industry, aren't straightforward issues. A 2022 study of 700 board members by consulting firm PwC found that less than half of directors believed their peers had a good grasp of these ESG issues. But adding new blood can be a challenge. Ada points to Amazon, which in 2018 received a fair bit of flack after a shareholder pushed the board to diversify its then all-white, mostly male 10-person board. The board rejected the proposal.
And that really shook the stakeholders of Amazon. They felt that Amazon wasn't taking seriously the issue of diversity. They didn't really care about their concerns. And so when stakeholders start questioning the company, that's when companies start losing legitimacy. So things don't have to go spectacularly wrong for organizations to possibly suffer from a lack of diversity. Even small things like that can actually start other individuals on questioning whether firms are committed to social issues and issues that concern them.
Building a better, more diverse and thought board will be a challenge, particularly for industries that have historically struggled to attract and retain diverse talent in the first place, such as the energy industry.
To your question of what happens to industries that don't really diversify, some of them are changing because they're dying industries. And it's because they haven't been diverse enough on any of these dimensions that they have really missed out and they've been lagging behind in terms of innovation.
Without new blood and with more homogenous boards, there are fewer fresh ideas, fewer compelling conversations. But not all hope is lost, and some of these industries that were lagging are catching up.
It's now that these industries are attracting people with different skill set and different backgrounds because they have no choice but to if they want to evolve and survive.
This has been the Rotman Executive Summary, a podcast bringing you the latest insights and innovative thinking from Canada's leading business school. Special thanks to Associate Professor Ada Siamak Wahid. This wraps our first season. We'll be back in September with new research and insights from our esteemed faculty. This episode was written and produced by Megan Haynes and Jesse Park. It was recorded by Dan Mazzata and edited by Avery Moore-Kloss. For more innovative thinking, head over to the Rotman Insights Hub and subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.